Hey everyone, welcome back to Seeking Witchcraft. It's your host Ashley, and today I have on Gianluca to discuss cartomancy. Welcome to the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to the listeners?
Hi, Ashley. Thank you for having me. And hi, everybody. I am Gianluca. I am a witch initiated in a Gardnerian tradition and an aspirant in the Wildwood tradition. I am also a big fan of cartomancy. So I practice tarot, playing card, Sibylla, and Lenormand. I've been doing that for many, many years as a teenager, more seriously within the past 6 years. It's my preferred form of divination, so I'm just really excited to share it with everybody.
Amazing. So, right off the bat, I know this episode is about cartomancy, but you mentioned a couple other types of divination as well. Could you say what those are again and what exactly those entail?
Yeah, totally. So cartomancy is an umbrella term for any sort of divination that involves cards. So tarot is considered a part of cartomancy and part of the cartomantic tradition. The Lenormand is a specific type of cartomancy that originated in Germany using the name of Madame Lenormand, who was supposedly the oracle to Napoleon. It's totally made up, by the way. But it's a 36 deck oracle card that was really popular back in the I don't recall the exact dates. I want to say it's like the late 1800s is when it gained popularity. The other one, called the Sibylla, is an Italian type of oracle tradition, and it's specifically a set of 52 cards that are used, each with a different symbol on it to describe and symbolize a specific aspect of daily domestic life.
Just, I guess, a question. So, what's just like the overall historical roots of cartomancy? Like, where did this start? And part of the reason I'm asking this, I mean, aside from just getting background information, is
Yeah.
uh, I see these. Gosh, I forgot what they're called, but they're called like witch playing cards or something, and they come in an orange box. And
Yeah.
they're kind of like marketed as like, oh, this was the original tarot card reading deck, but I don't know how true that is because I think people used to just use regular playing cards. Um, so yeah, like any insight you have on that, if you happen to know what I'm talking about, would be awesome.
Oh, yeah. Are they the Gypsy Witch fortune telling playing cards?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
that is like I feel like the marketing for them is very like we are the OG, and I'm like, are you though?
Yeah, in I'd say in the metaphysical world, especially in like divination, fortune telling, everyone wants the trademark of being the original form of divination. Um, but historically, I mean, playing cards have been used like throughout centuries as a form of fortune telling. Um, before we had, well, we got to keep in mind that when you think of tarot, right, that's like the main form of cartomancy people think of. That was originally just a game, like, and it still is played in parts of Italy. Um, and the use of it as a fortune telling tool came after that fact. So, historically, any sort of playing cards, whether that was playing cards as the way that we have it with the four different suits of spades, clubs, diamonds, and hearts, or if it's tarot with the trumps and then the four traditional suits of batons, cups, swords, and coins, their traditions have developed throughout different cultures, particularly in Europe, that attributed specific meaning to certain cards. And these fortune telling traditions, these fortune telling cartomantic traditions, were cultivated within those specific cultural pockets. Even like the Lenormand, which I referenced earlier, the Lenormand was originally a game. It was called the Game of Hope, and it was played in Germany by folks who, frankly, had more assets and money available to them. They didn't have anything better to do, so they just play those games. And eventually, they thought, I wonder if he loves me, or I wonder if she loves me. And this whole oracular system was developed out of it.
I would say it's quite amazing that humans ended up making regular systems out of just things like cards. But then I think about being a kid and plucking the petals off of like a flower and saying, he loves me not. And so I guess this is just a common theme throughout humanity.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's looking, I like to think of cartomancy and any form of like fortune telling or divination. It's the art of being able to see things that are in plain sight. Things
Yeah.
as plain as a playing card, like we all everything, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as say everything is a sign, but we're we're able to deduce that okay, things that we might overlook may often be a message from something else or, an omen of our future.
So how would you say that things like playing cards, tarot, like how does this differ from other different types of divination practices, like using a pendulum, for example, or even like a Ouija board, which is a form of divination, even though people like demonizing it. I
Oh
probably
yeah.
shouldn't have said the word demonizing because I feel like there's a pun in there somewhere. But anyway, yeah. How does this differ from other forms of divination? Like, why should people be not why, but like what causes people to choose one over the other?
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to cartomancy, folks tend to be drawn to it first, because I mean, I guess there's like I would argue that in the West, we're like culturally, when we think of divination, our first go to is like what's culturally accessible, which would be, say, like tarot or playing cards. Part one. Part two, I think it's because when you're working with, say, tarot, we have images, we have visuals that we're working with, or we even have symbols that we're working with. And we're able to look at those things right in front of us and deduce patterns to come with, to ultimately come up with a specific conclusion or answer that you read within the cards. When it comes to, say, for instance, pendulums or Ouija boards, I mean, there's still a system constructed in that, right? However, there are less things that we can visually look at to make deductions and to ultimately come with like the oracular message that we're hoping to get out of when we're consulting the cards or any other form of divination.
Yeah, that's fair. I probably should use a different type of divination, like in my example, like geomancy or
Yeah.
something a little bit more hardcore. So thinking of things like you mentioned, the imagery on the cards. So I know out there are so many different types of tarot decks that you can buy. So I just kind of want to get your opinion on this, and I hope what I'm about to ask you makes sense. If you buy, let's say, a Rider Waite deck, and you have, I don't know, the Devil card, and you buy a not Rider Waite deck, but like it still follows the same system. So just like an artistic version of that deck, but like, I don't know, a modern version, whatever. How do you think the symbols and imagery on these cards can contribute to the interpretation of the reading? Like, I know some of these cards are so modern looking that like if people are reading the cards or looking at the pictures on the cards to really understand what it's saying versus, let's say, memorizing the definition of the cards, like how do you think that interprets the reading that someone gives? Do you think like they're going to give the same reading if they use two different decks, even if it's the same card itself, if that makes
Great.
sense?
Totally. And I would say you would not. And I'll preface with something that when I've taught workshops, when I instruct or suggest folks say before they started reading is nothing means anything, so anything can mean something. And what I mean by that is all we have in us when we read cards is the cards in front of us. Yes, there may be this cultivated tradition around what the devil, quote unquote, means. But really, when we're at the face of it, like at face value, we're literally just looking at a card of a picture that's supposed to depict a being in which we attribute to as the devil. So when it comes to the way I've learned how to read, and again, this applies to all forms of cartomancy, but we'll use like tarot as the example, is that I would look at that card that's in front of me, and I would also think of it in context to the question that I'm being asked. You know, if this is a question about a message from the horned god, then right, like the symbol of the devil would be like very fitting to be a personification of the horned god, as an example. If it's a question about how crazy should my party be, then the devil is that energy of being wild, hell, maybe doing some bondage, right? Make it a sex party. I don't know. The second portion to that is I'd want to look at the cards around the devil. So I actually don't read positionally. No card the position of a card doesn't really mean anything, like no past, no present, no future. It's more just like looking at it holistically in terms of answering a question and creating a sentence. But I'd be looking at that individual card of the devil and say, okay, where is the devil looking? Is he looking to the left or to the right? What cards are to him? If there's a card next to him, let's say he's the first card and there's a second, well, how does the devil turn into that second card? And what is that telling me in relations to the question? Because ultimately, it's the question that informs the meaning and interpretations of the card. So we start with the question, we look at what's in front of us, because that's all we have is we have cards in front of us and pictures and illustrations or even symbols in the case of playing cards. And then we fit those two together to cultivate and develop meaning.
So let me ask, in your opinion, do you think that people should be reading the cards based off of the images or through memorization of the meaning or Googling the meaning or a little bit of both?
I think what's really important to think about this is I'm not saying tradition isn't important, right? Because there are meanings. So I guess let me back up. Hmm. What I
It's
would
funny. It's
say,
funny as a
yeah,
gardenerian.
I know.
Oh my
Fuck
gosh.
tradition. No, I'm just kidding. Um, no, I guess what I mean is tradition should never trump common sense. Does that make sense? So, like, we have these received, quote unquote, received, which again, really were just these meanings were all made up at one point. But we have these meanings, this method, this tradition that's brought to us when it comes to like the attributions of these cards. But we want to ask ourselves, why does it mean that? Like, I mean, we'll go use as example, like the two of cups, the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith image of it. It's two people, sharing cups with each other. We tend to create keywords, or we have, which is natural because we see, okay, two people. Okay, this is about a partnership, a relationship, X, Y, and Z. That could all be true, but the reason we're coming to those conclusions is because of what we see in front of us. All right. So we want to consider what has been passed to us, but then that should never ever trump common sense. Another great example would be, and I'm going to sort of move on a little bit, like talking about playing cards. So, as an example, let's say you have a reading about love and you want to know whether or not a relationship's going to work out. And the first card you have is the 10 of Cups. And then the second card you have is the 2 of Cups. If we were to go off of, traditional meetings, and again, I'm speaking in the context of the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition right now, we'd say, okay, yes, that means it's going to go great. You have 10 cups, you have this great family, and then we have those 2 of Cups where you have those two people drinking to each other. There's love, right? So we can look at it that way, but we also need to think we're going from 10 cups to 2 cups. That's going from a lot of love to less love. So we have to also think about more than just like what the meaning and interpretation of those individual cards are, but see dynamically what's happening in the spread. So we look at things like, intensity, like are numbers increasing or decreasing? We look at preponderance, like which suits are most visible in the spread. And we look at visual rhyming. So what's happening to that cup in the first card and where is it going in the second cup? And I think all of those combined help us produce helpful and effective readings. And I think like from the perspective of a beginner, I redone my training, I wish I learned that way, because I think sometimes for me, speaking for myself, I would get really stuck on those meanings. So I'd be like, oh shit, like this is a reading about work, and I have the 4 of Cups, and 4 of Cups. That means this means that. How's this playing? So when we get really like attached to that, it can kind of cause barriers for us to think more creatively and freely. And that's also why I prefer the cards that have less images in them, as a caveat. Side note.
I want to ask you a question about some spreads, and I know that we have a whole bunch more questions to ask about cartomancy in general, but we're going to take a short break and we'll be back in a second. Okay, welcome back. So, when using playing cards, for example, Are there different spreads that you can use for those that are similar to tarot, or is that kind of just like a tarot specific type thing to, I don't know, use like a, or do a Celtic
Yeah,
cross, for
so
example?
there are spreads that are used I guess we could say not really. So there's traditional spreads, but what I mean by traditional is there's layouts that you put out, but there's not necessarily like these fixed meanings. So like the Celtic cross is an example. It's like the first card in the vertical, like card number 6. I don't remember what it's called, but the one that represents you within the environment, right? There's nothing like succinctly and like distinctly like that, but there are spreads. So some of the common ones are the most classic is just the 3 card spread. You throw down 3 cards, and it's not past, present, future. It's a sentence. Subject, action,
Ooh,
yeah,
that's
object.
cool.
It's read like a book essentially, or a sentence. Another one that's pretty popular as well is the cross, but it's a little different. You have the 3 cards in the center, which is a comment on the question, like the overall assessment. On the top, you've got do. On the bottom, you have don't. So, as an example, let's say someone asks you, "How will the house party go?" And you shuffle your playing cards, and you get 10 hearts, 2 spades, 8 spades. Just looking at what we see in front of us, we go from lots of love to lots of spades, lots of love to lots of swords. So clearly, we already know that things aren't probably going to go great, right? So looking at these cards, so the way I would read this or formulate it into a single sentence, I tell the individual that overindulgence leads to conflict that magnifies. Overindulgence, 10 hearts, lots of feelings, lots of emotion, leads to conflict. 2 swords, what do you do with a sword you fight someone with? That magnifies. 8 swords, or excuse me, 8 spades. We go from 2 to 8. That's a lot. That's really fast.
Cool. I'm glad I asked for an example because I was sitting here in my head trying to think like, well, dang, I don't even know how I would put that together as a sentence. So thank you so much for giving an example for that. So let me ask, how does intuition play a role in cartomancy? And which I'm sure probably has a lot, but not only does how does it play a role, but what tips would you have for somebody who is looking to enhance their intuition with
Sure.
this?
The way So I'll start with like how I understand intuition, and particularly when it comes to divination, is I understand intuition as the same as clarity. And what I think is important in terms of like cultivating intuition, particularly when it comes to something like playing cards, is that you really just want to work with what's in front of you, and what you see, what you're able to interpret, and what you see, the sitter or the person you're reading for should be able to understand and see as well. Intuition's all about seeing those things that are hidden in plain sight, essentially. So when you're looking into playing cards, I would likely recommend to try not to overcomplicate it and just go by very simple rules. 1 is a little, 10 is a lot. 1 to 8 is fast, 3 to 5 is slow. 6 is more than 5, but less than 7. With hearts, you love. With coins, you make money and trade. With spades, you kill people and dig their grave. And with clubs, you hit and build and work. If you leave it at those like very basic fundamentals of like what those symbols quote unquote mean, and if you abandon any sort of ideas about what it has to mean, then you'll be able to create more fluid responses. Another recommendation I have with that is always read with a question, because if you don't have a question, you are kind of like taking stabs in the dark, and you might not really be as easily be able to interpret what you're seeing in front of you than you were if you had some sort of context to be able to guide how you read the cards.
I think that's similar in spell work too, where it's very important to be very specific to the point. If you leave things kind of ambiguous, it allows for ambiguous responses to come back. And if you're asking about something and you really know exactly what you want to ask, but you're leaving it kind of open ended, then you're going to get an open ended response, and it might just cause more confusion than
Exactly,
clarity.
exactly. Yeah, and that's why, like, I mean, cold readings are fun, and Cold readings are when you don't have any information you have to read for somebody, but you can only be as specific as the information that you received about it from the individual. I mean, if you're asking like a question about your career as an example, but you don't tell me you're a writer, I'll be looking at those spades a lot more differently than I did had I known you were a writer. Because, in some circumstances, if I were looking at those spades example, they look like pens, right? They look like pencils. So context really formulates the question and helps guide our readings.
I think that sometimes when people go to readers, they want to be as cold as possible. Not cold, but they want to give as little context as possible just to see, quote unquote, what can the reader get out of this? Like how psychic are they really? But while I can understand doing that just to, see if you're getting your money's worth, make sure you're not getting scammed. However, I think you bring up a good point that giving a little bit of context is going to be really helpful to the person who is doing the reading for you, especially if you're asking specific questions about like, what's my job, the future of my job look like. Well, if you don't say what type of job you're working, then it might be a little bit harder for the reader to get a clear picture or be able to read the cards properly. So it's just something to keep in mind if anyone's listening to this and they go to get a reading from a psychic. Sometimes giving a little bit of context is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah,
Just a thought.
absolutely. Because ultimately, like that's the reader, the psychic, they're there to help you, and I mean, you'll of course want to go to someone who you can trust, and a good way to know if you can trust them is through referrals and your network and asking folks within the community. But yeah, they're most of the time there to help you, and the more information they have, the more they're able to help you. I will say though that if you're ever giving
Definitely.
a cold reading, all you really, I mean, not all you really have to do, but all you can do is just go stay as true to what you see as possible.
So one question I had, it was something that you and I spoke very briefly on when we connected to record this episode, was you mentioned something called pips, and you talked about how reading with pips can benefit any divination practice or divinatory practice. So what are pips and what is
So pips, when it comes to cartomancy, refers to the the minor arcana, essentially. So that's the cups, in the cups, the coins, the batons or wands, and the swords. And when I say pips, we're specifically referring to the non-illustrated versions of the minor arcana. So whereas whereas the Rider Waite Smith deck has illustrations for the minor arcana, pip decks do not. There's just, if it's the 5 of coins, it's literally just 5 coins. If it's the 10 of cups, it's just 10 cups on a card, and that's it. Maybe there's some ornamental design around it, but there's no narrative or story happening within the card.
gotcha. So it really makes the reader, or well, yes, I guess the person doing the reading have to see exactly what's going on. I guess like use a little bit more of their psychic awareness and memorization skills to know what the card
Yeah,
says.
so when you just have the pips, you're stripped of all sort of visual, like I guess like you're stripped from conventional visual cues that might lead you to interpret or read a card in a specific way. So again, like we'll use the example of the 10 of hearts, right? When we see that card, let's again, using the Rider Waite Smith as an example, the traditional image of it in the Rider Waite Smith is basically a family looking at a rainbow, something to that effect. So when you see a card with a story, you're like, okay, so then I know it means this. But when you see a card with just 10 cups, or if you're using playing cards, just 10 hearts, that's literally all you're seeing. So what it forces you to do is look at the other cards that are around that specific card. It forces you to look at and observe what is changing in the tone of the spread. And it really helps you think, like, I think of it as like, it helps cultivate elasticity when it comes to our reading method, and encourages us to be a little more freeform and liberated. And I think it also goes back to this idea that nothing means anything, so anything can mean something. So when you don't have like a visual story happening, it's more easy to tune into that way of thinking, because meaning is cultivated as you read that card in regards to the other cards around it. So you'd be looking at things like the numbers. Is it increasing or decreasing? You'd be looking at the mood. Do we start with lots of cups and then end with swords, or is it the other way around? We look at patterns. Is 3 showing up a lot? And if so, how is it changing from left to right in the narrative? So by having this, again, like looking, it allows you to look more holistically instead of like focusing in on one card, because the message is often found in the entirety of the spread and not just in a single card.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. I think that's super cool.
It's fun. It also just makes for like, it's fun because I like to think of when I do cartomancy and when I use pips, it's detective work. I mean, all cartomancy is detective work, but when you have less visuals, it's like, okay, let me see what's changing and why it's changing, and then to be able to, it just makes it easier to identify those patterns, and then to be able to communicate that to the sitter.
I like that analogy of it being
Oh yeah,
detective work.
that's I fucking love it. That's why I liked Clue growing up. No, yeah, it's good. It's great, and like I also think when it comes to having less images in the cards, and I'm guilty of this too, but sometimes since we have less to go off, our answers are more concise. As a reader, I've delivered readings where sometimes I'm like delivering a very like long-winded answer when really sometimes simplicity is the best answer. He doesn't like you, you know, if the cards are saying, if we all we have is like 10 hearts that turn into 10 spades, that's going from lots of love to lots of hate. Um to to say
Oh
like,
man.
yeah, he hates you, versus seeing like an image of like a family, and then like the dead man, I mean, we'll likely come to a similar conclusion, but the way we communicate it might change. So I think there's also a benefit of like pip cards is the simplification of the message that you're delivering.
Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna need to look into pip cards. Maybe I can buy them on Amazon or from my local
Yeah,
shop.
yeah, yeah. Any playing card deck will do. So, yeah.
Oh, fair. Yeah, that I mean, yeah, playing cards. Oh gosh. Okay. Well, Gianluca, thank you so much for coming on to discuss cartomancy. This has been really educational, informative. But before we go, I did have one more question for you. So, if you could give one piece of advice to beginner, it does not have to be about what we talked about. It could be about anything. What would that piece of advice be?
YOLO. Like, just seriously, fuck it. You only live once, as far as we know. I mean, that's the only certainty that we have. And do whatever the hell you want. And I would apply that to reading cards too. Look at it and, as best as possible, realize, basically just live fearlessly and read the cards fearlessly too. Because what's the worst that could happen? You can be wrong. Oh, well, shit happens. We just try again.
Yeah, I don't think you're gonna summon the portals of hell if your card reading is incorrect.
Oops, just kidding. No, exactly.
Just girly
Yeah.
things. Well, thank you again so much for coming on. How can the listeners find you on the
Yeah.
internet?
I'm on Instagram as Luca of Spades. So feel free to follow me. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me over a message. I also have a bunch of free resources that I've built out specifically when it comes to playing card divination that I'd be more than happy to share with you.
Awesome. And if anybody's interested in finding me, you can find me on Instagram at Seeking Witchcraft. I have a personal Instagram I started recently too. It's mostly just like gym content in my boring life, but it's Spells and Kettlebells on Instagram. You can find me on X, which I don't really use it anymore, but it's there. It's at Seek Witchcraft. Facebook at Seeking Witchcraft Podcast, or the Facebook group, which is Seeking Witchcraft. And if you like the show and want to support it, you can go on patreon.com/Seeking Witchcraft to support the show. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. I feel like I need to go find a deck of playing cards now and learn how to use them
I
properly.
love it. Yes, thanks for having me, Ashley.
Of course. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening.
Bye.
Bye.